Hi everyone and welcome to Core Lecture 13. Today we'll discuss understanding different source types. Before we begin, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document to write on, as well as access to the internet and access to your Project 2 materials. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll define the terms popular and scholarly source. We'll explore methods for distinguishing between popular and scholarly sources, and we'll examine the rhetorical affordances of both in academic writing. All right, so comparing sources. In academic writing, sources are often going to fall into one of two categories. They're either going to be considered a scholarly source or a popular source. Now, even though they can still form as evidence and still serve as evidence to a claim that you want to make, there are noticeable differences between the two that can impact your credibility and authority as a writer and someone who eventually in Project 4 wants to make an argument about something. So let's explore these differences in greater detail. Okay, defining scholarly sources. Now, from Project 3 and Project 4, I'm going to ask that you use almost exclusively scholarly sources. Especially for Project 3. Project 4, you have a little bit more wiggle room, but not as much. Now, what do I mean when I say scholarly sources? So you've probably heard this term in other courses before. Oftentimes, the word scholarly source or the phrase scholarly source is closely attributed to the library databases that Dixie State provides. Now, scholarly sources are publications, and they can be in the form of books or periodicals, so journals, that contribute to a body of academic knowledge on a given topic. So as we can see from these examples down here, the Journal of Economic Perspectives, the Journal of Popular Culture, Journal of Cellular Biology, Journal of Psychology, I think this last one is Journal of Special Education Technology. I'm having a little hard time reading that one in a little small font. But anyway, so you can see how each one of these examples contributes to a very specific body of knowledge. So if I were, let's say, reading through the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I probably would not find a race or gender analysis on Breaking Bad in it, but I could expect to find something like that perhaps in the Journal of Popular Culture. So they're very specific to a certain area of study. Now, the works that you'll find in these periodicals and books are often grounded in a discipline's theory and or reproducible experiments to further a topic's conversation. So, like what we've done with Project 2 and we've established a synthesis, really this is just, these journals and these books, these scholarly sources are just ongoing syntheses. So it's one person building off another's work, critiquing another's work, all to further the understanding a certain academic community has on a topic that they might be interested in. But again, you'll probably notice as you start to gather research that there are certain, perhaps, ways of conducting experiments if you're doing something more science or kind of science or STEM based. Or there are acceptable theoretical approaches. So if you're doing something more in the social sciences, philosophy, humanities, things of that sort, that are going to be more predominant in the work that you read. And that's kind of how you can tell that it's a good way of telling that something is a scholarly source, as if it references a certain pattern or acceptable sort of theoretical framework. Now, with scholarly sources, the works that you're going to come into contact with, they function as a form of inquiry rather than reporting necessarily. So the work that you're going to be reading is originally produced. It's not going to be like, you know, a game of telephone with, let's say, the mass media where they say, oh, so-and-so did this experiment and this is what they found. So you can see how that's more reporting. But the experiment itself and where that was initially published is going to be the scholarly source that you want to look for, not, you know, the mass media outlet that decides to report on those findings. So as you go through and you read, a lot of times, especially within the first, I'll say 2 to 3 paragraphs, you will see in a scholarly work someone talking about, I guess, the inspiration to say, oh, we are in the lab and we noticed that this didn't exactly work out right, or I did this reading and it doesn't really align with what we've talked about in the past. So within those first few paragraphs, depending on how long the article or book is, you will get that sense of inquiry rather than just this is what someone else said. Rather, you will hear language like, this is what's not being discussed, or this is what we can explore further. So this is what my work, what you're about to read, is going to focus on. For Project 3, which is going to be the annotated bibliography, I ask you to include only scholarly sources. And so then it's important that you understand how to confidently determine if something is a scholarly source or if it is considered more popular. These ways that we are, these kind of criteria, if you will, you of course don't have to check every box off. There are sometimes exceptions to the rules, which we can discuss, but you should try and tick as many of these boxes off as you possibly can. The more that you can check off, the more you can be confident that what you are engaging with is indeed a scholarly source. So first, they'll usually be found in special databases. So you can think about the library databases that you have access to as a student. So when you think about it, Academic Search Premier, JSTOR, Science Direct, these specific kind of databases that really serve as a hub for where you can find scholarly works. So more often than not, you're going to be able to find scholarly works in these library databases. However, there are times, if you were to search on Google through Google Scholar, perhaps scholarly sources might appear. Now, the only issue with Google Scholar and other types of search engines is that typically they will give you the abstract or a brief summary of the work, but then say, okay, now you have to pay $40 for the full article. So you do get stuck behind paywalls there. But because you're a student at DSU, you've already sort of circumvented those paywalls. So you can access them typically through the library database. So if you find something on Google Scholar or through a more popular search engine like Google, don't get discouraged if you can't access the text in its entirety. Rather, see if you can copy and paste the title of that work into the library database and you can find it there. So they're usually found in special databases. Again, not always, but it's a good indicator that if you find something on JSTOR or Science Direct or something along those lines, it's usually considered scholarly. Also, they're very specific in content. So, for example, I once had a student who was writing on a more agricultural based topic and found an article that was on a specific type of soil found in a specific part of the state. And it was just very detailed and zeroed in on a very specific way of approaching a certain type of soil. So this is actually fairly representative of most scholarly works because they're looking at specific inquiries, really regardless of the topic or the discipline that you are digging into. The focus of the article or the book is typically going to be extremely specific. Whereas, as we'll see here in a minute, with popular works and popular sources, the approach tends to be a bit more broad and a bit more wide sweeping. also, as you go through, you might notice that scholarly sources tend to use jargon or terms that would be familiar to those in the field. So this is where you'll start seeing more technical terms being used, words that perhaps that you might not know unless you took an upper division class in that subject or have worked already extensively in the field. The arguments that are presented tend to fill gaps left by other scholars or other researchers. Now, recall what I said that with scholarly sources, it's pretty much just a giant synthesis, especially as you get into these journals and books, because it's basically one person saying, hey, so and so brought up this point. It was really interesting, but I want to expand on it in this way, or I want to push back on it in this way. And so oftentimes what you will see is that with scholarly sources, they're responding to some kind of gap that exists, and oftentimes that is left by other researchers or scholars in the field. Also, with scholarly sources, they are written by experts in the field. So you won't get a reporter's take on it. Rather, you will get someone who has been studying a topic for the majority of their life, who is considered very knowledgeable in the field. And so oftentimes they are associated with universities or major think tanks or government entities. Usually when you go onto the library databases, you can find some type of author bio, and that'll tell you where they work, what their research history looks like, things of that sort. Also, scholarly sources have a very slow turnaround rate. So if you are researching a topic, let's say you're researching immigration. This is a good example. So let's say you're researching immigration, right? And you come across a scholarly source that's talking about that's analyzing numbers from 2016. You might find yourself saying, ooh, that's a bit outdated, 2016. But in fact, in terms of scholarly support, that's pretty recent. So there isn't as quick as a turnaround time on scholarly sources. They can often go months and sometimes years into the revision process. Now, why is that? Well, with scholarly sources and what makes them credible and preferable in academic writing is that when someone submits a scholarly article to a journal, it doesn't just go through for proofreading. Rather, what happens is the editor of that journal sends it out to other people associated with the journal or who are also experts in that topic or area, and basically will say, please review this, try the experiment, and try to reproduce the results that the author is saying that they have discovered or that they are bringing to us. And so you have other experts in the field who are basically checking the work before it goes through to publication. So you know that when you're interacting with a scholarly source, the information that you will find is going to be verifiable and it's going to be credible. It's very rare to see any kind of redaction or oops, we made a mistake in a scholarly source, much like you are accustomed to seeing in more mass media outlets. When you see a news source say, oh, initially it was reported this, we later found out this. You are probably not going to ever see that in a scholarly source. And if you do, it will be probably the only time you do. So, but because of that, like I said, the results that you are reading and engaging with and perhaps using as evidence for your argument later in Project 4, you know that the results are going to be verifiable and you know they're going to be credible. There is going to be very little room for error in the results that you engage with in a scholarly source. And also, and this can be very helpful when trying to find additional sources to learn more about your topic and perhaps to support your topic, scholarly sources include extensive references or an extensive works cited page. Now, this is basically where they say, this is where we're pulling our information from. These are the sources that we're borrowing from, much like you would do a works cited or a references page for your academic papers. You're going to find one in a scholarly source as well. Also, depending on the field, you will probably come across other types of sort of back matter material. So if there was a survey conducted, they will include the survey questions, or they will include additional detail regarding the methodology. And so basically, when people are citing their sources and saying how they got from point A to point B as clearly and as explicitly as possible, that's how you can start to tell you're working with a scholarly source. So again, you don't have to check all of these boxes, but the more you check, the more confident you can be that you are engaging and utilizing a scholarly source. Popular sources on the other end of the spectrum. Now, popular sources can be credible. There can be some good information in there, but at the end of the day, they are not scholarly sources. So let's define them. What is a popular source? Now, popular sources are commonly associated with mass media. I sort of hinted at that throughout the lecture thus far. Now, these are publications that are designed to inform rather than to function as a form of scholarly inquiry. So if you're reading through BuzzFeed or National Geographic or something along those lines, you're not going to hear someone say, oh, well, in this research, so-and-so doesn't talk about this, so I'm going to undergo my own original research. You probably will not find that in a popular source. Rather, what you will find is someone saying, oh, this scientist, this philosopher, this researcher found this gap, and here's me reporting on what they found. So they're kind of retelling the research that someone else did. And interestingly enough, when you engage with popular sources, they will cite scholarly sources. They will say, oh, according to a recent report in the Journal of American Medicine, or something along those lines. So again, you can see how they are designed to inform rather than to act as an avenue for scholarly inquiry or further intellectual pursuit. Also the content itself, because it is more report-based writing as opposed to inquiry-based writing, it's typically not grounded in theory or reproducible experiments. So it's highly unlikely that if you're reading through The Economist or through Time, and they're writing on some kind of economic or scientific experiment, they're not going to provide you, as the reader, a detailed description of the methodology. It's just not going to happen. They'll say, oh, this was the experiment. Here's a brief sentence on how this experiment was conducted. Whereas in a scholarly source, the methodology section sometimes can span for pages. So with popular sources, you're not going to get as much on the methodology or how the inquiry was conducted. So again, with these examples here, so The Economist, Time, National Geographic, Wall Street Journal, BuzzFeed, same goes for the TV sources as well. So Fox, CNN, MSNBC, things of that nature. They can have really great information to them. Certainly they can, but they are not considered scholarly sources. So how do we determine popular sources? So with popular sources, they can be found on apps or on popular search engines like Google readily and accessibly. So like I mentioned earlier, you can find a scholarly work on Google, but chances are strong that you're going to get stuck behind a paywall. Now, with popular sources, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get stuck behind a major paywall. So you think if you go onto BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed isn't going to say, oh, we let you read the first 2 sentences, now pay us $40 if you want the entire article. Certainly not. It is available for free. You probably will just have to sift through some ads. But popular sources are almost always readily available on more popular and accessible search engines. The content also tends to be more broad. So rather than, let's say you're writing on climate change. So rather than writing where a scholarly journal might say, oh, let's look at the impacts of climate change in the Four Corners area of the United States. So that, of course, is going to be very specific. With a popular source, though, they might say, let's look at climate change in the United States, which is so broad in comparison to this Four Corners region of the US. Language is also going to be accessible to a larger audience and is going to tend to avoid jargon. So you're not going to see a bunch of technical terms. And if you do, they are going to be heavily defined, heavily explained, and the use of them will be very sparse. You won't see it a ton. Rather, you will see language that really anyone could read, regardless of whether they are super familiar with the topic or if they would consider themselves researchers or experts in the field. Also, with popular sources, they typically tend to be written by staffed or freelance writers who often consult experts in the field, but they themselves are not experts. So remember how I said that, if you go into National Geographic, they might cite an article from a scholarly source from a scholarly publication. But the writer for National Geographic arguably is not an expert in the field. They are an expert in writing and in more journalistic type settings, but they themselves may have an interest in the topic, but they are not refined experts like those that they are citing from scholarly sources. And this is a really big way to distinguish between the two. Is who was it written by? Is it a journalist who happens to be interested in climate change, or is it a scientist who has studied climate change for the last 20 years? So you can start to see how that's going to impact your credibility as a writer if you cite a journalist who is interested in climate change versus an expert in climate change. Also, with popular sources, they tend to be published very quickly and are subject to future revisions. So, like I said earlier, it's very unlikely that you will see any kind of redacted or corrected material in a scholarly source, and that is because it has a longer turnaround rate. But with popular sources, I mean, we get new stories almost every hour. It seems like there's something new coming out each and every day. And as you go through and you read through this content, you wouldn't be very hard pressed to find at least one statement that says there was an update to this story, or there was a change in this story, or we'd like to make a revision based off of new information we've received. So you're going to be far more likely to encounter that in a popular source as you would a scholarly. Now, it often typically includes several narratives or direct quotes. Remember, oftentimes, the people who are writing these popular sources are not considered experts in the field, but they're citing experts in the field. Now, as a result, you will see a lot of direct quotes and narratives used to really borrow from the experts' experiences and their prior works that are informing the popular source you're engaging with. So now that we have defined those two, what I would like you to do for the lecture assignment is start to explore and start to get your feet wet on what a popular source will look like and what a scholarly source will look like for the topic that you're interested in. So, based on the topic you explored for Project 2 and would like to continue exploring in Projects 3 and 4, I want you to find one scholarly source and one popular source regarding your topic. Compose a brief write-up, so no more than 50 words each, justifying why you have categorized both sources the way that you have. So this would be you saying, okay, well, I found this article from JSTOR. Here's why I think it is a scholarly article. I found this article from, you using Google. Here's why I think it's a popular source. Then I want you to compose a brief write-up, no more than 100 words, discussing the differences and similarities in content between sources. So to put another way, what information was common between the two of them and what information was unique to both. Now, what this can do is that as you start to gather scholarly sources for Project 3, this will give you the opportunity to say, with more confidence, yes, this is a scholarly source, I can include it, or no, it is not, it is a popular source, I need to put it on the back burner perhaps until Project 4. So for the weekly homework, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to include your core lecture 13 summary and assignment in your week 7 homework submission. Now in your week 7 homework submission, you should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 13 and 14, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And that is going to be due to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, February 24th. If you have any questions or would like to chat about these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.